Commander Vorath stood at the observation window of the Coalition's staging platform and watched the stars burn in the endless dark. His 4 eyes reflected the distant light of a dying sun. His clawed hands rested on the cold metal railing. Behind him, the busy sounds of a dozen species preparing for war filled the air. But Vorath heard none of it. His mind was lost in memories of blood and fire. He was old now. His carapace, once bright green, had faded to the color of dried leaves. Deep scars crossed his chest and arms. Each one told a story. Each one reminded him of battles fought and enemies killed. For 40 years, he had served the Kethrani Imperial Fleet. For 40 years, he had walked through the worst horrors the galaxy could offer, and he had survived them all. The Vraxi were the first monsters he had fought beside. They were tall creatures, with 8 limbs and skin like wet stone. Acid ran through their veins instead of blood. When they were injured, that acid sprayed outward and burned everything it touched. Vorath still remembered his first joint mission with them. He had watched a Vraxi soldier tear apart an enemy with its bare hands. The creature had not stopped to think. It had not shown mercy. It had simply killed and killed, until nothing remained alive. The Vraxi did not speak much. They did not need to. Their eyes said everything. Those eyes held only hunger. Only the endless desire to hunt and feed. Vorath had learned to work with them, but he had never turned his back on them. Even allies could become prey if the hunger grew too strong. Then came the Gorvan. They were not a single creature but a swarm. Millions of small bodies sharing one mind. They moved like water, flowing over battlefields and consuming everything in their path. A single Gorvan was harmless. 1,000 could strip the flesh from bones in seconds. 1,000,000 could eat a city. Vorath had coordinated with the Gorvan during the siege of Hollow Moon. He had watched them pour into enemy fortifications like a living flood. The screams of the dying had lasted for hours. When it was over, nothing remained but clean white bones arranged in neat piles. The Gorvan were efficient. They wasted nothing. But even they were not the worst. The Null Walkers existed only at the edge of reality. No one knew where they came from. No one knew what they truly looked like. Looking at them too long caused madness. Vorath had seen strong soldiers tear out their own eyes, rather than see a Null Walker for one more second. He had learned to look away. He had learned to listen for their footsteps, without turning his head. Working with the Null Walkers required a special kind of courage. They could not be killed by normal weapons. They felt no pain. They had no fear. They simply walked forward until everything in front of them was dead. Vorath had fought beside them twice. Both times, he had questioned his sanity afterward. These were the monsters of the galaxy. These were the creatures that made other species lock their doors and pray to their gods. Vorath knew them all. He had bled beside them. He had watched them kill, and slowly, over the long years, he had stopped being afraid. Fear was for the young. Fear was for those who still had something to lose. Vorath had lost everything long ago. His family, his homeworld, his belief in a kind universe. All that remained was duty. All that remained was the next mission. And now, the next mission had arrived. A Meridian diplomat named Scylla had brought him the assignment 3 days ago. She was a small creature with silver skin and eyes like black pools. Her people were known for their wisdom and their talent for seeing things others missed. When she smiled at Vorath, he felt uneasy. The Coalition needs an observer for the Arcturus Station assault, she had said. Someone with experience. Someone who can evaluate a new species under combat conditions. What species? Vorath had asked. They call themselves humans. Vorath had searched his memory but found nothing. The name meant nothing to him. I have not heard of them. Few have. They are new to the galactic community. Their homeworld is a small planet called Earth, orbiting an unremarkable star on the edge of explored space. Scylla had handed him a data tablet. The briefing file contains everything we know about them. Vorath had read the file that night. It did not take long. Humans were warm-blooded mammals with soft skin and fragile bones. They had no natural weapons. No claws. No venom. No armor. They could not see in the dark. They could not survive extreme temperatures. They needed to eat multiple times each day and sleep for a third of their lives. In short, they were prey. The file also noted that humans had requested non-combat roles in the assault. They were providing medical support and engineering assistance only. They had specifically asked to avoid direct fighting. Vorath had set down the tablet and felt something he had not felt in years. Relief. After decades of monsters, perhaps a gentle species would be refreshing. Perhaps this would be the quiet mission he needed before retirement. He could observe the humans, write his report, and finally rest. He had gone to Scylla the next morning to accept the assignment. She had smiled again when he agreed. That smile still bothered him. It was the smile of someone who knew a secret. Someone who was waiting for a surprise. "You will find the humans interesting," she had said. "They are not what they appear to be." "Nothing is," Vorath had replied, but he had not believed her. He had looked at the images in the briefing file. Small bodies, flat teeth, soft hands. There was nothing special about humans. They were simply another weak species trying to survive in a galaxy full of predators. Now, standing at the observation window, Vorath watched a human ship approach the station. It was called the Resolute. A small vessel, barely armed, carrying a crew of perhaps 50. It looked like a transport ship, not a warship. It moved carefully through the debris field, avoiding conflict, taking the safe path. Vorath clicked his mandibles in disappointment. He had hoped for something more. But he was a professional. He would do his duty. He would observe the humans and write his report. And then he would finally be done. The Resolute docked with the station. Vorath straightened his uniform and walked toward the hangar bay. Behind him, the stars continued to burn. Around him, monsters prepared for war, and somewhere in that small, fragile ship, the humans were waiting. Vorath did not know it yet, but his understanding of monsters was about to change forever. The hangar bay was crowded with representatives from 6 different species. Vorath recognized most of them. There were Kethrani soldiers like himself, their green carapaces gleaming under the lights. There were Meridian diplomats in their flowing robes. A group of Raxi stood in the corner, their acid blood pumping visibly beneath their stone-like skin. Even a few Gorvan observers floated near the ceiling, their tiny bodies clustering together like a living cloud. Everyone was waiting for the humans. The airlock cycled open with a hiss of pressurized air. Vorath leaned forward slightly, curious despite himself. He had seen the images in the briefing file. But images were never the same as reality. The first human through the door was a female. She was small, barely reaching Vorath's thorax. Her skin was pale, almost white, and her hair was the color of dried blood. She wore a simple uniform with no armor. Her only weapon was a small projectile device holstered at her hip. She walked with confidence, her eyes scanning the room and taking in every detail. Behind her came more humans. Males and females, young and old, carrying equipment cases and talking to each other in low voices. Their language was strange to Vorath's ears. It rose and fell like music, soft one moment and sharp the next. He did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. These were professionals. They were focused on their work. The first female approached Vorath directly. She did not hesitate. She did not show the deference that weaker species usually showed to Kethrani warriors. She simply walked up to him and extended one of her small, 5-fingered hands. "Commander Vorath?" Her voice was clear and steady. "I'm Lieutenant Katie Marsh. My team's ready to integrate with your medical bay." Vorath looked at her hand. Among humans, he knew, this gesture was a greeting, a sign of respect. He reached out and grasped it carefully, aware that too much pressure could crush her fragile bones. Her grip surprised him. It was warm and firm. He felt rough patches on her palm. Calluses, he realized. The marks of repeated hard labor. This female worked with her hands, She was not soft in the way he had expected. "Welcome to the staging platform," Vorath said. "Your quarters are prepared. The assault begins in 3 cycles. We'll be ready." Marsh released his hand and turned to direct her team. "Danny, get the surgical equipment to Bay 4. Amy, check in with their engineering staff. Kyle, you're with me." The humans moved with quick efficiency. They did not waste time on ceremony or formal introductions. They simply went to work. Vorath found himself watching them with growing interest. Their movements were strange. They walked on 2 legs like the Meridians, but their gait was different, more aggressive somehow, more purposeful. Over the next 2 cycles, Vorath observed the humans closely. He told himself it was his duty. He told himself he was gathering information for his report, but in truth, he was curious. These creatures were not what he had expected. They worked hard. Harder than any species he had encountered. They set up their medical equipment in hours, a task that should have taken days. They integrated their systems with the Coalition technology seamlessly, finding solutions to problems that had frustrated Kethrani engineers for weeks. They asked questions constantly, always learning, always improving. But they also did strange things, things that seemed inefficient. They stopped working every few hours to consume a hot brown liquid called coffee. This drink appeared to have no nutritional value. When Vorath asked about it, Marsh had smiled and said it helped them focus. He did not understand how a bitter liquid could improve mental function, but the humans seemed to believe it deeply. They also talked constantly. Not about work, but about seemingly meaningless things. Their families, their homes, stories from their past. Sergeant Danny Reyes, a broad-shouldered male with brown skin and a loud laugh, spent an entire hour telling another human about something called a baseball game. Vorath listened carefully but could not understand why throwing a small ball was important enough to discuss for so long. And they slept. Every cycle, without fail, the humans would stop working and close their eyes for 6 to 8 hours. During this time, they were completely vulnerable. Any predator could have killed them easily. Yet they did it anyway, trusting that someone would protect them. Vorath found this deeply unsettling. In his experience, only prey slept so deeply. Predators slept with one eye open, ready to fight or flee at any moment. The humans slept like creatures who had never known fear. On the second cycle, Sergeant Reyes noticed Vorath watching from across the medical bay. Instead of looking away or showing nervousness, Reyes grinned. His white teeth flashed in the artificial light. He walked over to Vorath without hesitation. "First time working with humans, Commander?" "Indeed," Vorath admitted. "We probably seem pretty boring compared to the Vraxi." Reyes gestured toward the corner, where the acid-blooded predators were gathered. "Those guys are intense. I saw one of them eat a metal panel yesterday. Just chewed it up and swallowed it." "The Vraxi consume metals to strengthen their internal structures," Vorath explained. "It is efficient, sure, but it's also terrifying." Reyes laughed. That strange rhythmic exhalation that humans use to express amusement. "We're a lot simpler. We just eat food, drink coffee, and try not to die." Vorath considered his words carefully. "You appear delicate." He expected the human to be offended. Instead, Reyes laughed again. "Yeah, we get that a lot. No natural armor. No claws. Can't spit acid or walk through walls." He shrugged his shoulders, a gesture Vorath did not understand. "We're just regular old humans. Nothing special." "Then how has your species survived?" Reyes was quiet for a moment. His smile faded slightly, replaced by something more thoughtful. "That's a good question, Commander. I guess we just don't know when to quit." Before Vorath could ask what he meant, Marsh called Reyes back to work. The human nodded at Vorath and walked away. Still smiling, Vorath stood alone in the medical bay and considered what he had seen. The humans were small and weak. They had no natural defenses. They wasted time on meaningless activities like drinking coffee and telling stories. They slept like prey animals, and yet something about them bothered him. Something he could not identify. Reyes had said they did not know when to quit. Vorath had heard similar statements from other species. Usually, it was empty boasting. A weak creature trying to seem strong, but Reyes had not been boasting. He had been stating a simple fact. Like commenting on the weather or the color of the walls, Vorath did not understand. He was not sure he wanted to. He turned away and walked back to the observation deck. The assault would begin soon. He would watch the humans hide in their safe medical bay while the real warriors fought. He would write his report and complete his mission. Everything was proceeding according to plan. That was his first mistake. The assault on Arcturus Station began at dawn. Not that dawn meant anything in space. But the coalition commanders liked to follow the old traditions. They liked to begin their wars when the light was rising somewhere. Vorath watched the battle from the command deck of the staging platform. Holographic displays showed the station from every angle. Blue lights marked coalition forces. Red lights marked the enemy. And slowly, as the hours passed, the blue lights pushed forward. The enemy was a group of separatist rebels who had seized the station 6 months ago. They were well armed but poorly trained. They fought hard, but they could not match the coalition's superior numbers and firepower. By the 4th hour, victory seemed certain. Vorath allowed himself to feel satisfied. This would be a clean mission, a simple victory. He glanced at the section of the display showing the medical bay. The humans were there, treating wounded soldiers as they arrived. They were doing their job quietly and efficiently. Nothing remarkable, nothing worth noting. Then everything changed. The first sign was a flicker in the holographic display, a brief moment of static, there, and gone. Vorath frowned. The technology was too advanced for glitches. Something was wrong. The second sign was the screaming. It came from the lower levels of the station, a sound unlike anything Vorath had heard in 40 years of warfare. It was not the scream of a creature in pain. It was the scream of a mind being torn apart. "What is that?" someone asked. No one answered. No one knew. Then the reports started coming in. Coalition soldiers in the lower levels were going dark. Their communication signals vanished one by one. Teams sent to investigate stopped responding. And slowly, impossibly, the blue lights on the display began to turn red. Not enemy red, something else, something the system could not identify. "Commander!" A young Kethrani officer ran onto the deck, his carapace pale with fear. "The lower levels are compromised. Unknown hostile entities. They're coming through the walls." Vorath's 4 eyes widened. "Through the walls? They don't follow normal physics, sir. Our weapons are not effective. The Vraxi contingent is already gone. The Gorvan are scattering." Vorath turned back to the display. He watched in silence as more blue lights vanished. This was not possible. The Vraxi did not fall easily. The Gorvan did not scatter. Something terrible was loose in that station. "Show me," he commanded. The officer brought up a security feed from the lower levels. At first, Vorath saw nothing. Just empty corridors and flickering lights. Then a shadow moved across the screen. Not a normal shadow. This one had depth. It had weight. It seemed to pull the light into itself, leaving nothing behind. "The Hollow," Vorath whispered. He had heard stories. Every veteran had heard stories. The Hollow were ancient. Older than the Coalition. Older than the stars themselves. They existed partially outside normal space, feeding on the minds of living creatures. They could not be killed with bullets or blades. They could not be stopped by walls or shields. They simply passed through everything, taking what they wanted. No one knew where the Hollow came from. No one knew how to fight them. The only defense was to run, to flee as fast as possible, and pray they did not follow. "The station has hollow hibernation chambers in the lower levels," the officer said, his voice shaking. "The bombardment must have awakened them." To station, Vorath closed his eyes. The mission was over. The station was lost. There was nothing to do now but evacuate and hope they could escape in time. Around him, the command deck fell into chaos. Officers shouted orders. Communications crackled with panicked voices. Species that had fought together moments ago now fled for their ships. thinking only of survival. 3 transport vessels departed within minutes, then 2 more. Then the Vraxi warship, its crew abandoning their still-living soldiers on the station below. The Gorvan swarm scattered into the void, their hive mind broken by the psychic interference of the hollow. Vorath watched it all with cold acceptance. He had seen retreats before. He had seen armies break and flee. It was ugly, but it was survival. Against the hollow, there was no shame in running. Then Lieutenant Marsh walked onto the command deck. She looked different from before. Her face was pale, and dark circles surrounded her eyes. She had been treating wounded soldiers for hours without rest. But her voice was steady when she spoke. "Commander Vorath, we're getting reports of wounded in sections 7 through 12. The hollow are active throughout the area. I'm taking my team in." Vorath stared at her. He was certain he had misheard. "That is suicide." Vorath stared at her. "There are people trapped down there. They are already dead. Or they will be soon. The hollow cannot be fought with conventional weapons. Your species has no natural defenses against psychic intrusion. Ask him soon. Common into scriptside." End quote. Marsh did not blink. "We have wounded in those sections. Coalition soldiers. Our allies. We're not leaving them behind. You will die." "Maybe." Marsh turned toward the door. Vorath felt something he had not felt in decades. Confusion. This made no sense. The humans were weak. They were fragile. They should be running like everyone else. Instead, this small female was walking toward certain death to help strangers. "Lieutenant." Vorath's voice stopped her at the door. "Why? Why? Why?" Marsh turned back to face him. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, he saw something there. Not fear. Not courage. Something older. Something deeper. "Because they need us," she said simply. "And we don't leave people behind." She left before he could respond. Vorath stood on the command deck alone. Around him, the evacuation continued. Ships fled into the darkness. Soldiers ran for their lives. The tactical display showed more blue lights vanishing as the hollow spread through the station. And somewhere in that dying station, a dozen humans were walking toward the monsters. Vorath should have let them go. He should have written his report about their foolish deaths and returned home. That was the logical thing to do. That was what a veteran of 40 years should do. But Vorath had spent his entire life fighting beside monsters. He had never seen anyone run toward them before. Before he knew what he was doing, he had grabbed a weapon from the emergency rack. Before he could think about it, he was walking toward the airlock. He did not know why. He did not understand his own actions. He only knew that he had to see what happened next. He had to know if the humans were truly as foolish as they seemed, or if they knew something that the rest of the galaxy did not. Vorath followed the humans through the dying station. He told himself he was there to observe, to document their deaths for the Coalition records, to understand how the hollow affected human neural structures. These were logical reasons, professional reasons, but deep inside, he knew the truth. He was curious. For the first time in decades, he wanted to see what would happen next. The station corridors were dark and cold. Emergency lighting flickered overhead, casting long shadows on the walls. The normal sounds of a working station were gone. No hum of machinery, no voices of crew members, only silence, broken occasionally by distant screams. The human team moved in tight formation. Sergeant Danny Reyes took point, his primitive projectile weapon raised and ready. Behind him came Lieutenant Katie Marsh and the other humans. Corporal Amy Vance covered their rear, walking backward with her weapon pointed at the darkness behind them. They communicated in whispers and hand signals. No wasted words, no unnecessary sounds. Their movements were coordinated with an efficiency that reminded Vorath of the Gorvan hive mind. But these were not creatures sharing one consciousness. These were individuals, each thinking separately, yet working together as one. Vorath had never seen anything like it. The first wounded soldier they found was a Kethrani engineer named Torek. He was pinned under a collapsed support beam, his carapace cracked and leaking green blood. His eyes were wide with terror. "The shadows," Torek whispered. "They came through the walls. They touched my mind. I could feel them feeding." "Form, you're safe now," Marsh said. Her voice was calm and steady. "We're going to get you out of here." Reyes and another human lifted the beam while a young medic named Private Kyle Torres examined Torek's injuries. Torres was barely more than a child by human standards. His hands shook slightly as he worked, but his eyes were focused, and his movements were precise. "Broken carapace, internal bleeding, possible neural damage from psychic contact," Torres reported. "He needs surgery. I can stabilize him for transport." "Do it," Marsh ordered. They worked quickly. Too quickly, Vorath thought. A proper medical procedure should take time. Should be careful. But the humans did not have time. The hollow could return at any moment. Torres finished his work in minutes. 2 humans lifted Torek onto a stretcher and began carrying him toward the exit. The rest of the team continued forward, deeper into the compromised sections. They found more wounded as they went. A Meridian diplomat with burns across her silver skin. A Vraxi soldier who had torn off his own limbs trying to escape the psychic assault. A group of station workers huddled in a storage closet, crying and holding each other. Each time, the humans stopped. Each time, they provided aid. Each time, they kept moving forward. Vorath watched in silence. He did not help. He could not help. His mind was too busy trying to understand what he was seeing. Then the hollow attacked. It came from the ceiling, passing through the metal like smoke through air. A mass of living darkness, deeper than shadow, colder than void. It had no shape, no form, but Vorath could feel its hunger. A psychic pressure that made his 4 eyes water and his heart's race. The creature descended toward Private Torres, who was kneeling over a wounded patient. Tendrils of non-light wrapped around the young human's skull. Vorath could see the darkness pressing into Torres's mind, searching for memories to consume, emotions to devour. Torres screamed. It was a terrible sound. The sound of a consciousness being torn apart, the sound of a mind fighting for survival. Vorath had heard that scream before. It usually ended in silence, in emptiness, in death. But Torres did not stop moving. His hands, shaking violently, continued applying a bandage to the wounded soldier beneath him. Tears streamed from his eyes. Blood poured from his nose. His entire body convulsed with the psychic assault, and still, he kept working. "Almost done," Torres gasped. His voice was broken. Each word was a struggle. Just a few more seconds. Vorath stared in disbelief. This was impossible. The pain alone should have shattered Torres's mind. The hollow's feeding should have reduced him to a vegetable. No creature could function under such an assault, but Torres was functioning. He was finishing his task. Sergeant Reyes moved without hesitation. He grabbed a UV flashlight from his belt and fired it directly at the hollow's manifestation point. The creature shrieked, a sound that existed more in the mind than in the air. It released Torres and pulled back into the ceiling. Torres collapsed. Marsh caught him before he hit the ground. "His mind," Vorath whispered. "How did he function?" "The pain should have destroyed him." Vorath whizzing why. In was starting the texture of why. Marsh looked up at Vorath. Her face was grim but calm. "He had a job to do. That is not an answer. It's the only answer I have." She handed Torres to another human and stood up. The team continued forward. Behind them, the wounded patient that Torres had saved was still breathing. Still alive, because a young human had refused to stop working, even while a monster ate his mind. Vorath followed them in silence. He had no words. He had no understanding. The next hours were a blur of horror and wonder. Vorath watched Reyes carry 2 wounded aliens through a kilometer of compromised corridors. Each alien weighed 3 times the human's body mass. Each step should have been impossible, but Reyes did not stop. He later admitted that he had recited song lyrics in his head to maintain focus. He could not explain why this worked. Neither could Vorath. He watched Corporal Vance perform emergency surgery on a Meridian diplomat with shrapnel in her heart. Vance had no training in Meridian anatomy. She used a tutorial on her handheld device, reading instructions aloud while her hands moved with mechanical precision. The diplomat survived. He watched Marsh negotiate with a station administrator who had been partially taken by the hollow. The creature in the man's mind tried to trick her, tried to use his voice to lure her close, but Marsh kept talking. For 3 hours, without rest, without food, without once breaking eye contact, she talked to the tiny piece of the man that was still human. She convinced him to fight the entity in his mind. She held his hand while he screamed his way back to sanity. When it was over, Marsh vomited from exhaustion. Then she immediately asked for the next patient. Vorath watched all of this. He documented none of it. His mind was too full of questions he could not answer. These creatures were fragile. They were soft. They needed sleep and coffee and meaningless conversations. By every measure he knew, they should have been prey, but they were not prey. They were something else entirely. Something Vorath had never encountered in 40 years of warfare. Something that frightened him more than any monster he had ever faced. The siege of Arcturus Station lasted 11 more hours after the hollow appeared. 11 hours of darkness and screaming. 11 hours of monsters hunting through the corridors. 11 hours that Vorath would remember for the rest of his life. Coalition reinforcements arrived at the edge of the system. They brought heavy weapons and specialized equipment for fighting psychic entities. They brought hope, but by the time they arrived, the humans had already won, not won the war. A dozen fragile creatures could not defeat an ancient evil. But they had won something else. Something more important. When the rescue teams finally reached the compromised sections, they found 64 survivors. Kethrani soldiers, Meridian diplomats, station workers, even a few Vraxi who had been too wounded to flee with their ship. All of them had been written off as dead. All of them had been abandoned by their own people. The humans had saved them all. Vorath stood in the medical bay and watched the survivors being treated. The room was crowded with wounded and dying. Doctors from a dozen species worked side by side, trying to undo the damage the hollow had caused. The air smelled of blood and antiseptic and fear. In the corner, the human team sat together. They looked terrible. Dark circles under their eyes. Blood on their uniforms. Hands shaking from exhaustion. 3 of their number had not survived. Their bodies were laid out on stretchers nearby, covered with white sheets. But the remaining humans were not crying. They were not celebrating. They were simply sitting together, passing around a metal container of coffee, speaking in low voices. Vorath walked over to them. He did not know what to say. He had never been good with words. Lieutenant Marsh looked up at him. Her face was pale, and her eyes were red from lack of sleep. But she managed a small smile. "Commander, you made it." "Commander." "I did." Vorath looked down at the humans. They seemed even smaller than before. More fragile. More broken. "You're fallen." "I am sorry." Marsh nodded. Her smile faded. "Private Chen. Private Lopez. Corporal Martinez." They knew the risks. They went anyway. Why? It was the same question he had asked before. He still did not understand the answer. Reyes looked up from his coffee. "Because someone had to, sir. And we were the ones who were there. Other species fled. Stronger species. Species with better weapons and natural defenses. Why did you stay?" "Why did you stay?" The humans exchanged glances. Something passed between them. A silent communication that Vorath could not read. Finally, Vance spoke. "We ask ourselves that question sometimes. Why humans do what we do. Why we run toward danger instead of away from it. Why we help strangers who can't help us in return. Do you have an answer?" Vance shook her head. "Not really. It's just who we are. We see someone in trouble, and we can't walk away. Even when it's stupid. Even when it gets us killed." She paused. "Maybe especially then." Vorath considered her words. They made no sense. They defied every law of survival he knew. A species that prioritized others over itself should not exist. Evolution should have eliminated them long ago. And yet, here they were. He sat down beside them. His old joints protested, but he ignored the pain. He had been sitting on command decks and observation platforms for too long. He had forgotten what it felt like to be among soldiers. "I have fought beside monsters," Vorath said slowly. "The Vroxy, who know only hunger. The Gorvan, who feel no pain. The Nullwalkers, who cannot die." The humans listened in silence. "I have never been afraid of any of them." Vorath paused. He was not good with words, but he tried anyway. "Today, I watched your Private Torres maintain consciousness through an assault that would have shattered a Kethrani's neural cluster. I watched your sergeant carry impossible weight through impossible circumstances. I watched your lieutenant refuse to abandon the doomed." Marsh looked at him with tired eyes. "We just did what anyone would do." "No," Vorath said firmly. "You did what humans do. And I do not believe anyone in this galaxy truly understands what that means." The words hung in the air. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Marsh reached for the metal container and held it out to Vorath. "Want some coffee? It's terrible, but it helps." Vorath took the container. The liquid inside was dark and bitter-smelling. It looked deeply unpleasant. He drank it anyway. It was, as promised, terrible. Hot and bitter and strange. But somehow, it was also comforting. A small warmth in a cold universe. "Why do you drink this?" he asked. Reyes laughed. "Because it keeps us going. Because it gives us something to share. Because sometimes, the small things are what matter most." Vorath did not understand. But he was beginning to accept that he did not need to understand. Some things simply were. The stars burned. The void was cold, and humans drank terrible coffee and ran toward monsters to save strangers. He looked at the human team. They were small and soft and fragile. They had no claws or armor or venom. They needed sleep and food and each other. By every measure that mattered, they should have been prey. But they were not prey. They were something new. Something the galaxy had never seen before. A species that did not survive by being the strongest or the fastest or the most deadly. They survived by caring, by refusing to give up, by running toward the fire instead of away from it. In 40 years of warfare, Vorath had never encountered anything more terrifying or more beautiful. He sat with the humans until the reinforcements arrived. He drank their terrible coffee and listened to their quiet stories. He watched them mourn their dead and comfort their wounded. He saw them smile through their tears and laugh through their pain. And when the rescue ships finally came, when the doctors tried to take the human team to the medical ward, Vorath stood up and spoke. "These soldiers require rest, not treatment. They will remain in the officers' quarters. I will personally ensure their needs are met." The doctors looked at him in surprise. A Kethrani commander did not care for foreign soldiers. It was not done. But Vorath did not care what was done. He had spent his life fighting beside monsters. Today, he had found something better. He had found humans. And he would not forget what they had taught him. Not about war, not about survival, but about what it truly meant to be strong. The Hollow were still out there, somewhere in the dark. Other monsters still hunted through the galaxy. The universe was still cold and cruel and dangerous. But now Vorath knew something he had not known before. There were creatures in this universe who would stand against the darkness. Not because they were powerful, not because they would win, but simply because it was the right thing to do. And that, Vorath realized, was the most terrifying thing of all. Because if the monsters ever truly understood what humans were capable of, they would not hunt them. They would run.